Good morning. We're going to focus on the second industrial revolution today, which begins in earnest right around the Civil War and definitely picks up steam so that by the beginning of 1900, America is a global economic superpower. Well, what is the Industrial Revolution? We're talking huge economic changes. You've got massive technology revisions and changes. You've got the production using machines instead of just human labor. People are moving to cities. For example, on the lesson we covered earlier, in 1750 Britain, only 15% of people live in a city. In 1850 Britain, 50% of people live in a city. By 1900 Britain, 85% of people live in a city. That is that urbanization movement. Now, the revolution does begin in Britain. We sort of steal it and bring it to the United States in the 1800s. And it's going to move us, just like it did with Britain, from a farming economy to a manufacturing economy. A lot of that is because farmers were able to produce more with less people. It's called the agricultural revolution. And that's going to allow the industrial revolution. The industrial revolution relies on something called the factory system. This is where all parts of making something, whether it's a car, whether it's canned food, whatever, are made in one building using unskilled workers who do one small part. In the picture here, they might be adding spokes to a wheel. That's all they do all day long. They get very good at it. They get very fast at it. But because it doesn't really require a lot of prior training and skilled knowledge, you can pay people very little to do it. That process of performing a simple task and moving the product on is called the mechanized assembly line. We, of course, still do it today with many things, and people tend to think of cars. It's going to reduce the cost of production, again, because it's easy to replace workers. They're only doing one small part. Another thing that's really going to be important for the Industrial Revolution is cheap steel. It's going to allow for buildings to go much higher and to be more affordable. And this is the Bessemer process. Henry Bessemer came up with the idea of blasting some hot air as iron is melted. It actually burns off the impurities. It allows steel to be made cheaply. Coming to the business philosophy, the idea is of business owners like Andrew Carnegie here. I know today we say Carnegie Hall, but the Scottish pronunciation is Carnegie. But gentlemen like him believe that a cheap workforce is essential to what goes on in America. Their goal, and people like Carnegie certainly achieve it, is monopoly. This is where one company supplies the product or service for their area, and it destroys all the competing companies. So when you think of one company that dominates, in today, obviously, Amazon dominates in online retail. Amazon's doing everything it can to get rid of its competitors. Walmart doesn't really have a monopoly. Why? Because it has Target. It has other competition, these large stores that are constantly putting pressure on it. People like Carnegie made darn sure that they could get rid of whatever competition they had so that they could charge the prices that they wanted. Great example. John D Rockefeller created Standard Oil. And until it was forced to break up in the early 1900s, it was the oil company of the U.S. To show you how powerful it is, when Congress forced it to break up, look at all the companies it created. And all the companies that we have today that in our minds are huge corporations, they were just part of Standard Oil. Now, John D. Rockefeller lowered prices. He was able to drive out all his competitors from the oil industry. That gave him enormous power. Earlier, Carnegie Steel, he made sure to not only keep his prices low originally, but he bought the mines where he got the ore. He bought the ships and the trains that would deliver it to his factories. He owned all of those processes, which means he could do his work much cheaper. Now, as time goes on, monopolies are going to be seen as bad. And once it's seen as bad and harmful for the economy and the workers, Congress, as I showed you earlier, passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. And it makes monopolies illegal. Currently, we're seeing Walmart and Amazon being investigated for monopoly violation. So in the next couple of years, we'll see how that turns out. You're certainly welcome to watch that video if you go online, YouTube. It is Crash Course History, Industrial Revolution. Many unskilled workers come to the U.S. on ships. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, that's steerage. You don't get a window seat. You don't get a lot of wonderful things on that ship. The ship takes you from England or France or what have you to New York. That's it. It's just transportation. And so steerage packs tons of immigrants in these ships crossing the Atlantic. But this is pretty clear to the skilled workers, the people who are getting paid more but now see their livelihood are being jeopardized from immigrants and factories. And so you begin to see these skilled workers forming unions. And a union is a group of workers who come together and they negotiate with their bosses for the pay they're going to get, the working conditions. Some of the more famous unions we have know the airline pilots union, the professional football players or baseball players unions. Those are skilled workers who are trying to protect their interests. Unions hate immigration because that brings in cheap labor. It risks the jobs of Americans. For example, the United Farm Workers in the 20th century, Cesar Chavez, wasn't necessarily a lover of unions. One of the reasons why is it tended to lower the prices that his union members would get. Now, if a union doesn't get what they want in terms of benefits or pay, they can initiate a strike. This is where they stop working, and it sort of forces the company to negotiate or give in, but there is at this time no right for people to strike. And so companies would use hired armies called strike breakers and beat the living snot out of some of these union members. And then later they'd get them fired. But there are some costs of this progressive era. Government, again, refuses to control most businesses. Because of that, children were oftentimes employed instead of in school because they could be charged a lower rate for work. And because of that, you're going to see an entire generation of people who can't better themselves because they don't have that education. Pollution increases. It's going to lead to smog and sickness within the cities. This is a picture near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the 1940s. The Cuyahoga River is literally on fire. I mean, the river is burning. That's how much pollution was in the factory. And factories at this time have very few safety protections. For example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. There is on the 8th and 9th floors a clothing factory where young women and some men are working. Someone starts a fire accidentally. Unfortunately, because the fire escapes collapsed, because most of the doors had been bolted shut or there were choke points in the entrance and exits for the building, hundreds of women were trapped. 146 are going to die in this factory fire. No employer, no owner is going to get into trouble. This shows you the power of business at the time, even to the detriment to the workers. Americans believe that owners are more concerned about making money than the safety of the people that they employ to make the products and make themselves rich. Again, locking people in a building. And one of the more disturbing aspects, as I said earlier, is child labor. You can tell from some of these pictures here, we are talking about abject poverty. In some of these faces, there's no hope whatsoever. Young boys who should be in elementary school instead are working in a factory or in a mine. These are the type of factories, again, children, smaller hands, smaller body parts, they could reach around. They'd be easier for them in order to adjust the machine and just to monitor it. You take a look at this young boy here, no shoes. Incredible safety concerns. This young girl, you got to believe what her mind is on, and it's not on work. She desperately doesn't want to be there. Young boys would sometimes sell newspapers to make ends meet. Of course, mining was a very common occupation. Breaking up the ore could be pretty brutal. And I'd also like to point out, you can see with the guy in his staff here, sometimes employers and supervisors could be pretty brutal to the employees. Health is going to be an issue. For mining, there's something called black lung, and you're going to see large numbers of people die within 10, 15 years of cancer or other breathing issues. As I said earlier, one of the reasons that children were hired was because they could get into those places that adults couldn't, and because they were cheaper. Great example. But the machines are built for adults. This poor girl can barely see what she's working on. If families had to bring their young children, if they couldn't work, would just have to quietly stand there. If they could work, it's free labor for the business owner. So there were advantages if you were a business owner to this process, but obviously the kids are not going to have any change in their outlook. Shoe shining, carpentry were common occupations, and of course, they don't have a lot of clothing. They can't go down to the nearest grocery store or go down to the nearest Walmart in order to get new clothes. So you're constantly having to maintain your own limited supply of clothing. And a lot of these people, immigrants and non-immigrants, are going to rely on benevolent organizations and charities in order to survive. There just wasn't the money and resources for them to make it. Now, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, make sure you're reviewing this for your test coming up, and have a good day.